So we ended yesterday's class on this slide. That is, you know, we can of course stratify a sample based on one single factor, based on gender or based on their party affiliation. But at the same time, we can stratify a sample based on multiple features. So imagine we want to stratify COMG majors based on their gender, men and women, and their status as domestic students versus international students. My question for you yesterday is how many strata we should create. Okay, so I hope you have devoted some thoughts to it, but if you haven't, that's also okay. We can do this together. So it's relatively easy if we only consider what if we only stratify COMG majors based on one single factor, let's say gender. And you can immediately say that, based on convention, right, we can and we should create two strata. With men, we have women. Okay? Following the same reasoning, here is even easier, right? Because I have already told you that there are two types of students, domestic, international. So if we simply stratify COMG majors based on this dimension, we'll similarly have two strata, domestic, international. But now we're combining these two dimensions. We're stratifying COMG majors based on their gender and based on their student status at the same time. So this creates sort of a problem that is, well, then how many strata should we include? Should we create? Okay? Well, the answer is 4. But I want to emphasize that, how you get this answer is important because I can sort of imagine and hope I'm wrong that you get this number by saying or reasoning, I have two strata here under gender and I have two strata here under domestic, international, so 2 plus 2, that will give me 4. Okay, so this is a typical example of you have the correct answer based on wrong reasoning, right? So the way that we get 4 is not by addition, but rather by multiplication. 2 times 2 equals to 4. And why we're doing multiplication here? Well, here's the reasoning, okay? So whenever we have multiple dimensions based on which to stratify a population, we always do it by layers, right? Here's what we mean. We have population here. That's all COMG students or COMG majors. The first stratification you would do is to base this stratification on gender. Doesn't matter if you start with gender or their status, right? Let's say we start with gender. So we know this is kind of easy because we only have two gender groups by convention. But then the next question to consider is, of course, what would be the second layer of stratification? Because you can consider, well, there will be male domestic students and there will be male international students. Similarly, we have women or domestic female students and international female students. See, this is our first layer of stratification and this is our second layer of stratification. So why is multiplication? Because for each strata in the first layer, it has two further, well, for each stratum at the first layer, it has two strata under it, right? So here we have 2, and then we have another 2, right? So that's 2 by 2, right? We have 2 such layers, right? This is one layer, and we have 2 layers of this kind. So it's 2 by 2, right? And just to verify that multiplication rather than summation makes sense, let's make this example even more complicated. So domestic, international, and what else can we think of? Um, Native. Okay. So let's designate that domestic means they're from U.S. mainland. Okay. Native means they're from this island. Okay. International, of course, from other countries. So now my question is how many strata do we create? Okay, I'll give you several seconds to consider while I take a sip of water. Um, what should we answer? Okay, so if you have paid attention to this lecture all along, you should know the answer will be 2 times 3, 6. Okay? But okay, you're saying, well, I only know this because I know that Andrew said you should do um, multiplication. Okay? Because if you do summation, it will be 2 plus 3. That will give you 5, which of course is not 6. So this is wrong, and this is correct. But how do we make sense of it? Right? So let's do this, visualize this again. So we have COM-G majors. And then we start as well by stratifying based on gender with men, women by convention. Now you should know that under each stratum in the first layer, there will be 3 groups: domestic, international, and native. And we repeat this further stratification a second time under women, right? Domestic, international, native. So we have 1 3, 2 3s. So 2 3s, that gives us 6. Well, you say, well, what if we start the stratification by their status? That will give you the same answer, right? So we stratify by status, so we'll create 3 strata at the first step. So domestic, international, native. Under each stratum in the first layer, we have male domestic, female domestic, male domestic, female domestic, and repeat this for the third time. Male domestic, male native, male, female native. So we have 1 2, 2 2s, and 3 2s. So 3 2s, that's 6. There we go. Okay? So this is how we decide or work out our plan of stratification. Okay? So I'm going to erase all this. But, it's a video clip, so you can always rewind and, sort of make sense of the procedure here. So my next question is how do we visualize, this stratification plan, which we have already done, okay, on the trees and decisions, branches, right? So, okay, so we've done that. Now the question is, okay, let's decide that or assume that, within all COMG majors, right? So this will be our population. So the population gender proposition will be men versus women is 2 versus 1. And in this population, we have, for every 1 international student, we have 4 domestic students. So let's say Angie would like to sample 300 COMG students. A question for Angie and for all of you will be, how many male domestic students should Angie recruit? Okay? So you should very easily be able to work out how many men should Angie recruit if we only have this one dimension, right? That will be very super easy, right? Because we're all very smart, intelligent, and we know what to do. So, first of all, let's work out how many men, you know, there should be, in the population. So for every two men, we'll have three people, or for every three people, we'll have two men. So two plus one, right? That will give us the population, because in this population there are only men and women. So it's two plus one that gives us the population. So every three men there will be two. Every three people there will be two men. So now we want 300 of them. That will give us 200 men. So we should include 200 men, all right? But it's also very easy if we only have this stratification, right? So now let's ignore men, women, and how do we solve this problem? How many, let's say, domestic students should we have? So very easy, right? So we can first work out, for every five people. So 4 plus 1 is 5, right? So for every five people, there will be 4 domestic students. And then we times that with 300. So this 5, we should have 240. I hope I'm right. I think I'm right. Okay, so if we only stratify by gender, Angie should have 200 men. If we only stratify by status, Angie should recruit 240 domestic students. But now the question for Angie is how many male domestic students? That is, how many students that are men and domestic at the same time, right? So obviously we cannot simply add these two numbers together, because if we add them together, that will give us what, 440 people, and that's larger than our sample size, so that can't be the case. And similarly, we can just do a simple subtraction, because if we subtract 200 from 240, that will give us 40, and that doesn't look right either. Okay, so here, just as we work out the plan of justification by layers, via a step-by-step procedure, we should also work out the number step by step. Okay, so here's the correct procedure to do this. Okay, so let's start by stratifying this population based on gender, and we want the number of men that Angie should include. So that's easy. So 2 over 3, right? For every 3 people, 2 plus 1, there will be 2 men. So, and we want 300 people, so that will give us 200 people. Okay. Now, this is the critical second step. This step suggests, or the reasoning behind this step is, for men and women, the proportion between domestic and international students will be the same. Let me repeat. For both men and women, so we have 200 men, we have 100 women, the proportion of between domestic students and international students will be the same. That is, if we only look at the male group, there will be 4 domestic students or 4 domestic male students for every 5 male students. And this proportion should be the same for men and for women. right? So in other words, at this second step, this is our first step, right? Stratify by gender. At the second step, where we stratify by student being domestic and international, our sample size is no longer 300, but 200. Okay, so and if we can, make sense of this step, right? That is, now we should stratify men based on their being domestic or being international. Then the second step will be very easy, right? Because for every 5 men, there will be 4 domestic students. So we simply time this by 200. And that's very easy to calculate. We should have 160 male domestic students. Okay? 160. Similarly, right, we can figure out how many male international students there should be. Right? So the first step is still this, right? To figure out how many men we need, 200. Well, then for these 200 men, how many international students there should be? Will be 200 times, what is it? For every 5 men, there will be 1 male international students. That's 40. Okay? And then you can similarly work out how many female domestic students, how many male international students, and how many female international students. Okay? By repeating the procedure. So we just said that here is 40. Okay? How about women? Women is easy, right? So we just said, because men and women, the proportion is 2 to 1. So that means if we want 300 people, we'll first of all need this much women. Okay, so this is the number of women we need. Now, for the next step, we'll be treating this number, whatever number it is, right, as the sample size. And now we reason, well, for this many women, there will be 4 international students, 4 domestic students for every 5 people. Okay? So we can solve this, problem very easily. So 300 times 1/3, that's exactly 100, times 4/5, that's 80. So we should have, 80, right? 80 female domestic students. How many male international? We just worked this out. 40. Okay? How many female international students? Very easy. We first work out how many female or women we need. Now work out how many international students we need. This is 1, right? Because for every 1, for every 5 people, 4 plus 1, there will be 1 international student. So this is 100 times 1/5, 20. Okay? We can quickly verify this. 160 plus 80, that gives us 240. 40 plus 20, that gives us 60. Fantastic. We add these two up, that will give us 300. So we satisfy the first criteria, right? We need 300 people. Now, do we keep the proportion of men and women correct? We should, because now we'll have exactly 200 men and we have exactly 100 women. 200 versus 100, that's 2 to 1. We have exactly 240 domestic students and 60 international students. So 240 divided by 60, that's exactly 4, right? 4. For every one international students, we have 4 domestic students. So everything works out. Okay? So make sure you understand this example, right? And then I will give you a further question here. Okay, there actually is no further questions, but make sure you understand this, and that will be very critical for you to work out the homework assignment. Okay, because I believe there's very similar, questions on the homework assignment that will need you to work out the number of people that one should include in a sample based on multiple stratifications. Okay? All right. Cool, huh? And interesting. Okay, now let's look at another example, which is not really stratified sampling. So let's imagine there's this country named Asirama in the world, okay? And it has a population of 321 million people, okay? And this country is divided up in a very interesting way. It has exactly 50 states. Sound familiar, huh? And these 50 states are very much like each other. We call it very homogeneous. Okay, homogeneous being very similar, have very similar gender composition, as in all states has similar compositions of, political parties, have similar levels of education, blah blah blah. Well, there will be differences, of course, across the states, but they're largely similar. Okay, so here's the qualifier here. Okay, so your goal is to analyze the personal income of this country. And we just said if you want to analyze the personal income of a country, the unit of study will be individuals, right? You need to survey every single person in this country about, the person's income level, okay? But then, of course, you don't have that much resources to perform a study that includes everybody in this country because there are 321 million of them. You have simply no possibility of surveying every and each of them. Okay? So you decide to draw a representative sample of, as Raminians or as the Ramins. Okay? How would you proceed? How would you proceed to draw a representative sample of people from this particular country? Okay, pay attention to the feature of this country, that it has 50 states that are more or less like each other. Aha, that sort of gives us a hint. That means if the country, or if the population of 321 million people are divided into 50 states that are largely similar to each other, that means we don't have to survey every single individual from every single state. We can probably first of all decide, or randomly decide more precisely, to survey a subset of the 50 states. because, well, they're largely homogeneous, meaning your survey study, state one is very like, will be very much like the result of surveying state number two. And the result from surveying state number two will be very similar to surveying the state number 50 because, well, they're more or less like each other. There will be differences, but not huge or vast differences. Okay? If you are thinking this way, then congratulations, you are thinking the correct way. So, more precisely, there are these steps we could follow. And we call this particular method of sampling multi-stage cluster sampling. Stage 1, or step 1 in this case, is to randomly sample a subset of the 50 states. And then from the selected states, you randomly sample a subset of counties, assuming that counties in any particular state are also largely homogeneous. And from the selected counties, you sample a subset of cities, assuming that the cities are also largely homogeneous across each county, and do the same thing for blocks, do the same thing for households, and very lastly, you randomly sample an individual from the selected households. So the advantage of doing this, or the advantage of performing multi-stage cluster sampling, excuse me, as you can see, you by randomly select all these subunits that constitute the entire country, you effectively reduce the amount of work that you should do. Because, for example, right, let's say out of the 50 states, you randomly select 25 of them. And from the 25 states, you select, perhaps for each selected state, you select, let's say, 10 counties. And for each 10 for the 10 counties in each state, you select 5 cities. And from the 5 cities that you select from each country, you select 3 blocks. And from the 3 blocks that you select from each city, you survey 10 households, right? And you select from the 10 households from each block 1 individual, right? So in the end, you're doing, how many people? So you're going to survey, from every single individual from 1 household, and that's from 3 blocks, and that's from 5 cities, and that's from, 10 counties, and that's from 25 states. So how many people are you surveying? So 30, that's 300, that's 1,500, 1,500 times 22, what is it? So 7,500, 30. You're only surveying 37,500 people compared to 321 million individuals. That's a huge reduction in the amount of work that you will need to do. But because you do randomly sample all the time, and because all these subunits, states, counties within states, cities within counties, blocks within cities, households within blocks, all these subunits, under the previous upper level units, share a certain degree or sufficient degree of similarity, you will still be able, if we follow random sampling closely, you will still be able to obtain a largely representative sample of the population. So that's the beauty of performing multi-stage cluster sampling, right? And multi-stage cluster sampling is usually performed on geographic units, states, counties, cities, blocks, households. And by doing that, you see, you're not surveying everybody, but still, the results that you apply, that you are able to obtain from surveying these many people should be, right, generalizable to the entire population, provided that you follow these steps closely or as closely as possible. Okay? So this is the idea of multi-stage cluster sampling, right? So the core idea, as we just illustrated, is to break the population into smaller, but you know, smaller units that are as similar as possible, right? That would be ideal, right? But of course, in real life, that's not never going to happen, right? We know that the state of Maine is very different from, it's kind of different from the state of California, right? You know, but still they're Americans. We can still have a certain amount of Republicans and Democrats and things like that, right? So it is possible that they share a certain degree of similarities. Okay, and of course, from each of the units, you obtain a random sample of the units, and you proceed with that, right? So then, for a thought exercise for you, then imagine you would like to study the quality of primary education in U.S. How would you plan your sampling, right? So, for example, given this is your goal, right, to study the quality of primary education in the U.S., you might think, well, perhaps, the unit of study here will be, primary schools, right? How good the primary school will be, right? So then you can say, well, let's first of all, select a subset of states in the United States, maybe 30 out of 50, right? Then from each of the state, you select certain counties. From the selected counties, you selected certain cities. From certain cities, you selected a certain number of primary schools, right? And then you go to evaluate or assess the quality of those primary schools in terms of student performance, etc. Okay, that will be one sampling plan based on multi-stage cluster sampling. So now we have two very useful types of sampling plan. The first is stratified sampling. Okay, so the core idea of stratified sampling is to divide populations into smaller units. But very importantly, the units that we divide the sample population into are very different. And they're usually non-overlapping, right? It's men versus women. In contrast, for cluster sampling, you also divide populations into smaller units, but the units that you are dividing the population into are ideally comparable, right? As comparable as possible, right? United States or provinces in China or provinces in Canada, etc. So you see, for both sampling methods, you're dividing the population into smaller and manageable units, but the nature or the content of the units are very different. Here you want very different units. Here you want very similar units. Okay? All right. So we'll end our third lecture here, right? So in this particular lecture, we introduced two important sampling techniques: stratified sampling and multi-stage cluster sampling. So the idea is that to obtain strata that could help us correct for the under or over representation problems, and cluster sampling is to help us to conduct surveys more efficiently, right? Especially when we encounter a goal that involves surveying a huge amount of individuals. Okay, so both sampling methods are very useful, and they're used in different contexts and for different purposes. Okay, so that concludes our lectures on surveys, and tomorrow we'll be talking about experiments, and at the same time we have our first assignment due by midnight tomorrow. Okay, that is before it turns the 21st. Okay, so as usual, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you tomorrow.